What's going on, guys? I'm Pete, and this is Retro Game Attic. So Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was recently released to almost unanimously glaring reviews, and it's awesome and everyone loves it, but I'm not here to talk about that today. I want to discuss that it is the first Nintendo Switch game to hold a $69.99 price point, and people aren't super stoked about that. There are already some $70 games on the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, but people seem particularly salty about the Switch getting such a high-priced game. I mean, I don't blame them. When you're used to a set $59.99 price point, an extra $10 is pretty substantial. It's an almost 17% increase, which is nothing to sneeze at. Now, Nintendo did clarify that only certain Switch games will be priced at $70, and their higher pricing will be determined on a case-by-case basis. I get it. Why would anyone be happy to pay more for literally anything? You'd have to be some kind of weirdo to be into that. I myself am not super shocked by the price point though, because if you are a gamer of a certain age, you do remember when $70 games were kind of a common occurrence. Sure, much like today, back then all games were not priced that high, but there were a good amount of games that were, or close to $70. I remember particularly that a lot of games during the 5th generation were commonly priced about $70, or sometimes even more, with many Nintendo 64 games bearing that $70 price tag. I don't remember many $70 games from disc-based consoles like the PlayStation and the Saturn, and by the time the Dreamcast was released, I don't think I ever saw a new game priced higher than $49.99. Which totally makes sense, since discs are much cheaper to produce than cartridges. But with all that being said, let's take a look at some old school video game store ads that I dug up and check out these crazy prices. First up, we have some Super Nintendo games from the January 1994 Electronics Boutique catalog. I really like the funky 90s penguin graphics, those are so random. So looking at this ad with today's game prices in mind, it doesn't seem too bad, but keep in mind that with inflation, $70 in 2023 money is much different than $70 back in 1994. There's plenty of inflation calculators available online, so I'm going to plug in the original prices for these games and then adjust them for April 2023 inflation. And let's compare the prices side by side. And wow, look at some of those prices for 1994. Each game equates to over $100, which is crazy to see. You could make the argument that there are some solid games on here. Mega Man X, Street Fighter II Turbo, Secret of Mana. They are all amazing classics by their own right, but I honestly would never pay this much for any of these games. Let's check out more SNES games from the same January 1994 EB catalog versus prices adjusted for 2023 inflation. Whoa. Check out the prices for some of these. $124.48 for Lester the Unlikely and Mario's Time Machine is just hilarious. I feel sorry for the kids who got these from their parents. Given the high prices back then, you had to make do with the game for a while, whether it be crappy or not, and I'm sure there were plenty of disappointed kids out there who got these. It wasn't just high prices on SNES games back then. Let's take a look at a 1995 Electronics Boutique catalog with some Sega Genesis games. Again, they are all over $100, with the two football games being especially offensive at that high of prices. None of these games today are particularly worth too much. I can attest that Vector Man and Comic Zone both rule in their own right, but I don't know if they're worth it at that high of a price. And maybe some of you are thinking that it's just Electronics Boutique that had the high prices back then. Well, let's see how Toys R Us priced their games. Next up, we have a Toys R Us catalog with an assortment of Genesis titles from around 1996. Geez, there are a bunch of $117 sports games. Sonic 3D Blast and Vector Man 2 are both pretty good, but not for that price. And $137 for Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 is wild. And that price for NBA Hang Time is seriously criminal. For real though, find whoever set that price for it and punish them for their crimes committed against people's wallets. I guess in comparison to the other titles here, $78 for Williams Arcade Greatest Hits doesn't seem too bad. Next up, we have SNES games from that same 1996 Toys R Us catalog. $117 for Madden 97 is rough. And again, the $137 for NBA Hang Time is just criminal. Street Fighter Alpha 2 is a graphically intense game given the hardware, but $137 is still pretty expensive even for that game. $104 for Yoshi's Island and Donkey Kong Country 2 are with a coupon, but $29.45 for controller isn't too horrible though. Let's graduate up to some 32-bit games here. Here's a 1996 Toys R Us ad with Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn games. Both are disc-based consoles, which what should be cheaper than cartridges, and it kinda shows with a handful of $49.99 games here. Let's run it through the old inflation calculator and see what we got. Don't get me wrong, they're all still very expensive, but a little more reasonable overall. $117 is the steepest price we have here, and that's for 3 PlayStation sports games, Alien Trilogy and NFL Quarterback Club 97 on Saturn, and for Nights into Dreams with the 3D control pad, which definitely sweetens the deal a little bit. And a side note, speaking of the Saturn 3D control pad, I actually snagged mine at my local Babbage's back in the day shortly after the Saturn was discontinued for $199 brand new. Check out that sweet $1.99 price tag. Anyway, like I said before, I remember there being a lot of $69.99 Nintendo 64 games, so let's move on to an N64 and Sony PlayStation combo Toys R Us ad from around 1997. Man, $74.99 for Doom 64, Turok, and Wayne Gretzky 3D hockey is out of control. Even Shadows of the Empire for $70 is up there. Seeing the N64 and PlayStation side by side definitely shows that the PlayStation lived up to its reputation of lower priced games versus the N64. And after we factor inflation, all of the N64 games break that $100 barrier, and just 2 PlayStation games exceeded $100. Regardless, all of these games are expensive, but the PlayStation is overall cheaper. I also find it pretty interesting that the N64 and PlayStation consoles are only $285 when adjusted for inflation, which by today's standards is a pretty fair price for a new console. Next up, we'll continue that N64 trend and check out some more Nintendo 64 games from the Christmas 1997 EB Games catalog. Again, they are all over $100 when adjusted for inflation, with Wave Race 64 and Shadows of the Empire topping out at $131. That is a lot of money. I love all of the games here, even Wave Race 64 and Super Mario 64 being among some of my favorites, but those prices are insane. The last store ad, but certainly not the least, is a FuncoLand store ad with some N64 and Game Boy Color games from around late 99 / like early 2000. For the sake of this video, I'm gonna go with January of 2000. If you're a fan of this channel, you may have seen my previous videos where I go through old FuncoLand price guides. I had a ton of good memories going to my local FuncoLand when I was a kid, all the way up to my high school days when they were eventually bought out by GameStop. What I'm getting at here is that I love FuncoLand. Anyway, by 2000, the N64 and Game Boy Color were approaching their twilight years, but they were still packing some heat. Pokemon Stadium with the N64 transfer pack is $116, and Mario Party 2 and Ridge Racer 64 are both just under $100. Definitely still some high prices here. The consoles seem to be a pretty good deal though. The N64 console with 2 controllers for $180 is solid, and the Game Boy Color for $143 isn't bad either. $53 for Game Boy games is a little pricey in my opinion, but not horrible. A lot of resources go into modern games with larger teams behind them, more complex design and mechanics which require more resources, and more intricate music and sound design. So to perfectly be honest, I think $70 for Tears of the Kingdom or certain other AAA titles seems like kind of a fair price in 2023, especially when compared to the wild 1990s prices for some games adjusted for inflation. Gaming is an expensive hobby and always has been, and after checking out some of these old 90s games adjusted for inflation, I really don't think we have it too bad today, even with the resurgence of that $70 price tag. What do you guys think? Do you feel that $69.99 is too much for Tears of the Kingdom, or do you think it's a fair price? Did checking out the prices for these old games change your mindset? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for checking out Retro Game Attic. I seriously appreciate each and every one of you, and I'll see you on the next one. Later.